All right, guys, so we're gonna refinish this work table. As you can tell, it's been through the ringer. I mean, look at all that stuff on there, right? And I said before I do my next video, I wanna make it look at least a little bit more presentable to you guys and just give it a touch up. Now, this is a Husky brand, and their tables are usually made of either rubber wood, which is a more, I would say economical type of wood. It's a solid wood. Or it could be pine, or it could be hard maple. I'm not quite sure. In any case, we're gonna try to get this looking a little better. So the first thing I'm gonna do is sand it down and get all those marks off of it, get it looking nice and smooth, and give it an even complexion. All right, so we're gonna start off with the 80 grit sandpaper here. That's the coarsest one. We're gonna use this to remove the old finish. Then we're gonna graduate on up to the 120 grit sandpaper. Then we're gonna jump to the 150 grit. And then in the final pass, we'll do the finest grit, and that's the 220. So basically, as you move through the grits, each grit removes the scratches from the previous grit and smooths the surface out even more. So the goal is to have a smooth surface, so you gotta start out with a rougher grit to take off the old finish, and then refine the surface as you go through the grits. The key is to sand with the grain. As you can tell on this table, the grain is running this way. You don't wanna jump from 80 straight to 220, because then it'll take forever to remove all the coarse scratches, especially if they're deep like some of these are. Okay, so I'm gonna use an orbital sander for this. And you may be saying to yourself, how can I move in the direction of the grain if I'm using an orbital sander, which spins 360 degrees? Not just that, it spins randomly, it switches directions. And that's a really good question, because you can't really sand with the grain with an orbital sander. But the random orbit is actually designed to prevent deep scratches that follow a single direction. So you want to move the sander slow and steady in the direction of the grain, even though the pad is moving in an orbital direction. And you don't want to stay in one spot, you want to keep it moving. Don't use that much pressure. Let the tool do the work. And then you want to overlap each pass by about half, 50%. Now remember, when you're putting on your pad, you want to line up the holes with the holes on the sander, because these are the vacuum holes. They suck up all the dust, which then goes into the dust bag. So you don't want to put it on where you're blocking the holes. That's going to clog up the sander, and you don't want to ruin your machine. So make sure you line the holes up. All right, guys, so just finished the 80 grit. Used about 3 discs of 80 grit sanding pads for this. If you notice, most of the marks are gone. I would say just about all of them, at least the ones I was focused on. And I know I sped it up for you guys, but this actually took about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour to do this. And that's just the 80 grit. So gonna continue with the 120, then the 150, then the 220. Not gonna show as much sanding, you guys get the idea. If you notice at times, I may have been doing this as I was sanding. That's a little trick there, right? But you gotta be very careful. When you put the pad on, sometimes it doesn't go on evenly. So you have this overlap kind of sticking out, right? If you don't put it on exactly right. Well, you can use that overlap to angle the sander into some stubborn areas, like you saw me doing later in my sanding process, because I was trying to get those dark, stubborn marks to come out. And this was just a quicker method because the sanding pad was able to fold like that and get into those grooves, into those gouges a little better and make them disappear. But like I said, you gotta be real careful because you can actually gouge deeper into your material. So if you're gonna do that, make sure you do it very lightly. Don't put any pressure, hardly any pressure at all into that. And then once you finish getting out your marks, go right over it with the sander to even it out. But it's definitely a faster and quicker way, maybe a little bit riskier way to get those stubborn marks off of your material. All right, guys, so we went from 80 grit to 120 grit to 150 to 220. So the next step is to wipe it off with a damp cloth. You don't necessarily want to use a dry cloth or rag because that's just going to push around the dust. A damp cloth will pick up the dust better. And we're going to let it dry for about 30 minutes. And then you may want to take a tack cloth or a microfiber cloth and go over it to get even more dust out. I'm gonna use a terry cloth pad to do another wipe down of the table and get some of that extra dust off of the table that you can't see that may be stuck in some of the crevices. As you can tell, there's always some left, even after you wipe it down with a damp cloth. Then I'm gonna take a fresh terry cloth pad and I'm gonna use some tung oil finish. Now this is not pure tung oil. Pure tung oil is much thicker, takes a much longer time to penetrate into the wood, and takes a much longer time to dry. A lot of products say tung oil on it, but it's not actual tung oil. It may have a very small percentage of tung oil in it, but it's mostly solvents and other ingredients that make up the solution. Nevertheless, tung oil finishes do work well and it's a matter of preference. And this is just my work table, so it's gonna get scuffed up again anyway. So we're gonna put a coat of this finish on it and call it a day. First, you wanna give the can a good shake. Then you can pour some on your material to test for compatibility, like the tone of the wood, color, and all of that. Yeah, that looks about right. You always want to wipe it or spread it in the direction of the grain. All right, so according to the instructions, you want to wait 15 minutes for that first coat to penetrate the wood. Then after that, you want to buff it with a lint-free cloth and wait about 24 hours for it to dry. Then after that, you want to apply a second coat, wait about 5 to 10 minutes, and then buff that again with a lint-free cloth. 2 coats should give you a decent appearance.